In late December 2025, merchants in Tehran pulled down their shutters and took to the streets to protest Iran's unbearable economic conditions, marked by soaring inflation and the constant devaluation of the country's currency, the rial. But what initially appeared to be demonstrations against Iran's deteriorating economy soon took on a very different nature. Death to the dictator and neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran, were among the slogans echoing across the country. Some demonstrators even called for the return of the Shah, Iran's monarch toppled by the Islamic Revolution. Faced with mounting protests, the country's authorities responded with a total internet blackout, thousands of killings, and tens of thousands injured. This is how the latest wave of protests was crushed. A level of repression never seen before, one that seemed to reveal just how threatened Iran's leaders felt. A crackdown that may well mark a point of no return and the unraveling of Iran's social contract. After silencing the streets, however, Iran now faces another threat, one that comes from outside its borders. The prospect of a military confrontation with the United States looms over the country, even as we speak. At the same time, regional diplomacy is working to avert escalation, and US President Donald Trump has announced a new round of talks. Now, how did we get to this point? What should we expect now? Welcome to Med Insights, the Med Dialogues podcast by ISPI, where we unpack the forces shaping the Middle East and North Africa and what they mean for global politics. I am Nicola Missaglia, Curator of the Med Mediterranean Dialogues. In this first episode, we explore how Iran reached this breaking point, what really is at stake at the upcoming talks with the United States, and whether the Islamic Republic is entering a phase it may no longer be able to control. Today, we discuss these questions with Ali Vaez, Senior Advisor to the President and Project Director, Iran, at the International Crisis Group, and Sanam Vakil, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Program at Chatham.
Dangerous phase in US-Iran tensions.
Israel had said it would reopen Gaza's southern Rafah crossing with
Protesters
Egypt.
in Georgia take to the streets for the
An immediate ceasefire
years of
and
war.
deployment.
That's something that
additional
Syrians
Lebanese
are trying to figure out right now.
Turkey's foreign minister says attacking Iran
This is my
will
home.
not be still positioned
In the Middle East?
The Middle East crossed a threshold.
For weeks, we have witnessed a massive military buildup in the region around Iran. Many of us were expecting a strike, but so far, no attack has taken place. Ali, why has President Trump hesitated, and what has changed in his calculation?
Well, I think there are several reasons. One is that the President Trump, promised to go to the rescue of Iranian protesters and assessed at that time that the U.S. was locked and loaded and ready to intervene, whereas it wasn't. The U.S. was overstretched with military deployments around Venezuela and simply did not have enough assets to be able to sustain a military campaign against Iran and defend its own interests and assets and allies in the region. And those protests are now gone. So if the U.S. intervenes, it will be a military intervention in search of an objective. And the president has since then changed the tune of why he has amassed this military armada near Iran, apparently in order to coerce Iran diplomatically into agreeing to a nuclear deal. And moving forward, Iran is a regime that is cornered and is facing existential angst, might react in a much more reckless way, might react in a way that it would result in American fatalities or significantly increased energy prices in the United States. And that in an election year is not a concept that President Trump is looking forward to. So I think a realization of the costs and questions about the benefits of the military intervention is the reason he has hesitated so far.
So the threat of a reckless reaction and the lack of a clear endgame seem to be keeping the pace for now. But to understand what happened today, we also have to look back at the 12-day war in June 2025, when the US carried out multiple strikes against Iran's nuclear program. Iran appears to have emerged weakened from that conflict, but how did the conflict redefine the regime's position?
I would say that the 12-day war was, I think, the culmination of a process between Iran and the US and Israel that is leading to a period of, more direct conflict designed to constrain Iran's regional influence and alter the internal dynamics, functionality, and cohesion of the Islamic Republic. And, hard to say if it's been planned in a clear way, but what the Islamic Republic, I think, has misread or miscalculated is that the 12-day war shouldn't be seen as disconnected from this moment that Iran finds itself in. It's part of a build-up of pressure, containment, but a more direct effort to constrain and tighten internal as well as external capabilities of the Islamic Republic.
Now, even with this pressure, there are whispers of a possible deal. However, Ali, you've noted that for the leadership in Tehran, the only thing that they deem more dangerous than suffering from a US strike is surrendering to US terms. Now, in what position does this situation put the Iranian regime?
Iran was ready as of when President Trump walked into the Oval Office in January of 2025 to come to a new nuclear deal with him. But a deal that would be win-win, but a deal in which Iran would be able to save face and preserve uranium enrichment on its soil, but subjected to restrictions. It became clear that that was not what President Trump wanted. He wanted Iran to completely dismantle its nuclear program, and he re-adopted US strategy of accepting only zero uranium enrichment in Iran, which does not provide the Iranian regime with a face-saving way out. Now, since then, the US seems no longer satisfied with just a nuclear deal. It also wants Iran to give up on its regional partners and proxies, the so-called policy of forward defense, and also to significantly restrict its missile program in terms of range and number of missiles, so that it no longer can pose a threat to Israel. That, from the Iranian regime's perspective, amounts to surrender, to capitulation, which they find more dangerous than suffering another round of military confrontation with the US and Israel. They've seen, of course, the fate of Gaddafi in Libya. He gave up his nuclear program and ended up being toppled with NATO military intervention. He has seen the fate of what happened to Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And so it's very unlikely that Iran would do a deal along the lines that President Trump wants.
And beyond the external geopolitics, there is the internal risk. A surrender could alienate even those who still support the Iranian leadership, the support the regime needs for its very survival.
There is also danger in this kind of agreement for the Iranian regime internally, because this is now minority rule by a regime that is hated by the majority of the Iranian population. And it's reliant on maybe 5 to 10% of the population who are willing to fight for its survival. And a deal in which the regime gives the whole store to the Americans signals weakness to adversaries abroad, and alienates the core constituents at home. And this is why it's just not possible.
While the regime fears surrender, it also fears its own people. Sanam, this protest movement is only the latest in a long series of uprisings that have resurfaced cyclically since 2009. They have changed significantly over the years. This time, the spark that seems to have ignited the protests was economic in nature. However, the demands behind these protests run much deeper than the economy alone. Over the years, and even more so today, they have taken on a different dimension.
Sure. I mean, I think we cannot distinguish these protests from the arc of protest history in Iran. It's tied to a long tradition and domestic effort across the country, multiple constituencies, to push back against an ineffective governance structure that has ruled despite the people. And that can't be disassociated from the government's tensions and hostile relationship with the United States that where the United States has tried to contain and sanction the Iranian political establishment. And that's, of course, had economic ramifications inside Iran that is strongly borne by the Iranian people. The sanctions have certainly made Iran's economic situation much worse, but that is not the sole motivation for protests inside the country. Ultimately, I think people are more mobilized because of poor governance, repression, political frustration. And that is because the core grievance between Iranians more broadly and the state is a lack of political agency or a political system that has frustrated popular ambitions and demands. While these protests broke out at the end of December and were primarily motivated by economic issues, they quickly spread and became political ones. And from a state perspective, because of external pressure, because of the 12-day war, because of the convergence of internal threat with external threat, the system in Iran cracked down in the most brutal way we have seen in a number of decades, killing an unprecedented, but the system's reaction is also, I think, unprecedented. It's always demonstrated a repressive capacity. It has a crackdown playbook. It knows how to violently get people off of the streets, and that violence only increases with every protest. But I think the decision or the calculation to do whatever it takes to get people off the streets is a result of these perceptions of external and internal simultaneous threats that are perceived to be existential for the system.
But what is happening in Iran now as we speak? Have the protests ended?
The internet is still formally cut off, although there is increasing connectivity. And that, of course, gives us greater access and insight into what has happened and what has taken place. There is still verification of the death toll still underway, and I think it's important to allow verifiable accounts to take place. So it will, take a number of weeks, if not months, in order to get there. But, more broadly, protests have lasted for a number of months in past rounds of demonstrations in Iran, up to 10 months in 2009, even in 22, 23. And the protests then begin to take different shapes. And what the Islamic Republic is worried about is that not that there is going to be a mobilization of millions of people into the streets, but that funeral processions could lead to more protests. And in fact, we're Iranians are finding ways to demonstrate their anger, sadness, and their grief in some of these funeral gatherings. But the society is being heavily surveilled. There are checkpoints and blockages all around the country, and it for the time being looks like these protests are contained. And of course, people are there are conflicting sentiments, anger that nobody came to help Iranians, anger towards the regime for the murder of citizens that have taken place, and real uncertainty about what is going to come, not just from a US strike potentially, but also from within Iranian society. So this is a moment of perhaps pause, reflection, and grief. But I can't imagine that the protest movement is going to die off.
Ali, you have used the term inflection point to describe this moment for Iran. What makes this specific wave of protests feel final for the social contract in Iran?
Well, look, this round of protest was different in its scale and scope, and given the fact that there was a sense of finality that is quite rare in these kind of protests. People expected the regime to fall very quickly. And it's because it has been weakened as a result of 2 years of confrontation with Israel and the United States. Its regional clout has diminished significantly. Militarily, it has been degraded. Its social contract with the Iranian society has been broken because it never brought prosperity or social freedoms, but it argued that it was bringing security. And even that was gone. And so with a rapid deterioration in the economic situation in the country, people came out in very large numbers, intersections of all sectors of the society, rural, urban, almost everyone. For the first time, the President of the United States had threatened to intervene militarily in Iran's internal affairs. And that, I think, resulted in the regime bringing down its iron fist with speed and ferocity we've never seen before. It has now killed more people than died in the Iranian Revolution or in all the other previous Iranian protests against the Islamic Republic combined. And so this is why this episode in Iranian history was very different and feels more like an inflection point.
However, in the end, the regime didn't collapse.
One of the reasons that the regime did not fall in these protests, despite the challenges they posed to its power, is because at the top there were no cracks, there were no defections from the security forces. So the regime remained coherent. And that is what I think in all of these years has been the reason for its survival, along with one other factor, which is the lack of a viable alternative. There is no organized opposition inside the country. There is no viable opposition outside of the country. And so that creates the fear among many in the population that in order to bring about change, they would have to maybe replace tyranny with anarchy. And that also is not a very positive picture for many Iranians. This is also, I would argue, the reason that so many in Iran or outside of Iran are now hoping that the military intervention from the United States would change the balance of power between the forces internally in Iran. And if the regime was not in a position that it could still survive for some time, because it still has the will and a fearsome capacity for repression, it would have been, there was no need for external intervention. The reason people are asking for the US to come and put its thumb on the scale is because the regime remains so much stronger than the society at this point. Now, change will come to Iran in any scenario. There is a natural factor. Supreme Leader is almost 87. But it could also happen as a result of unnatural causes. There might be realization within the political elite that Ayatollah Khamenei has driven the country into the ground. and that the country is now facing serious threats from abroad and also at home. And remaining in power just through pure coercion and repression is not really a sustainable option. So some people internally might engineer some sort of regime transformation, but it could also be imposed from abroad.
Sanam, today the whole region seems to be working to avoid the conflict between Washington and Tehran. What do you think?
Nobody has wanted to see a resumption of conflict between Iran and Israel, let alone between Iran and the United States, because there are deep fears that a military conflict with Iran will have spillover into the Middle East, impacting livelihoods, the economies, infrastructure, and the like. And so we're in this moment of regional diplomacy, perhaps to buy time or to find an off-ramp. But what's on the table, or what are the scenarios we can imagine? Yes, there is a chance, I think a slim one, but a diplomatic solution is found. Will it be sustainable? That much depends on the commitments of the leadership inside Iran, the support of the region, and particularly Israel. Before we got into this period of protests and conflict, I certainly expected an Israeli-Iranian conflict to erupt in 2026. So, that adversarial relationship is part of this dynamic as well. Another outcome, of course, is that the U.S. does strike, and the scope and scale of those strikes could precipitate further protests inside Iran. I think what the United States wants to do is try to encourage fragmentation across the regime so that new leadership emerges.
So we look at Trump's actions, the military buildup, the pressure, and we wonder what his final goal is. Could he be thinking about exporting democracy? Or are we going to witness a situation similar to what happened in Venezuela a couple of months ago?
I don't think that they're trying to promote a democratic outcome inside Iran or to support the return of Iranian opposition figures. I think that they would like to see a more pliant or compliant leadership emerge in Iran that works with U.S. interests. Trump is thinking about his legacy. He's thinking about positioning himself as a problem solver or peacemaker. He's thinking about economic opportunities. Iran is a frontier market. There's a lot of money to be made. You can imagine a Trump Tower in Tehran. I do think that model of economic coercion, military buildup, and forcing the system to adapt and concede is the Trump approach towards Iran. But it is certainly not going to produce a democratic outcome that maybe Iranians themselves are seeking, but it might produce an opportunity for the regime to rehabilitate and for the regime to obtain sanctions relief.
Now, if Trump succeeds in decapitating the leadership in Iran, or if the state collapses, Ali, you and other analysts have warned about quite uncertain and risky scenarios.
If the United States eventually decides that it wants to go in, despite all the risks, for a political decapitation operation, that will change the balance of power internally in Iran. There is also a scenario in which the U.S. ends up doing a much more extensive military intervention, maybe in response to Iranian retaliation, but ends up basically dismantling the state. Well, if that happens, then there are two possible scenarios. One is the emergence of an Iranian strongman, an Iranian Bonaparte, as some in Iran have been talking about, very likely a Revolutionary Guards commander or former commander who would consolidate power and turn Iran into a military dictatorship. Or there is the risk of civil strife, the likes of scenarios that we've seen in Libya or in Syria, in which the country would disintegrate along ethno-sectarian fault lines.
A new Bonaparte-like strongman or a Syrian scenario are quite terrifying prospects. Is there a third way, Ali? A path that doesn't end in chaos or a new dictatorship?
Diplomacy is a much better option and much low risk, and is worth trying, but trying in pursuit of realistic objectives. If the United States wants to limit Iran's nuclear program to account for the missing stockpile of highly enriched nuclear material, which, by the way, remains a big concern. I mean, imagine a scenario that in the fog of war or internal chaos or regime collapse, this material disappears. It will be a major breach of international security. Or if the US wants maybe restrictions on Iran's missile program, that could be a conversation that the US could have if the incentives provided to Iran are also security concessions. But my most important point is that all of these deals are unstable because at the end of the day, they're done with a regime that has lost its legitimacy at home. It doesn't really address the broader context of animosity between Iran and the United States. The solution is in political transformation. And the West has never used its massive leverage of sanctions and diplomatic isolation and pressure on Iran for anything other than hard security concerns that it has had. Iran's missile program, Iran's nuclear program. What I'm suggesting is that maybe time has come to incentivize defections at the highest levels of the Iranian system, or at least a debate about some sort of an exit ramp or soft landing by using the leverage of sanctions. Imagine a scenario in which the US and Iran agree that if the next Iranian election or a referendum, as a lot of civil society actors in Iran are asking for to determine the future shape and form of the political order in Iran, as part of an internationally monitored election, is allowed in return for sanctions relief. That is what I think has never been tried, and it's definitely worth testing, given the fact that all other options are extremely risky and the risk of backlash in all of them are much higher.
So, we're speaking in a moment where the logic of pressure is colliding with the limits of power. The risks of escalation are real, but so is the lack of a clear endgame. The coming days and weeks will tell us whether diplomacy becomes a real off-ramp or just a pause before the next round of confrontation. The positions of Washington and Tehran remain far apart, and many key issues still need to be resolved, from the nuclear program to the missile agenda, as well as Iran's network of regional allies. Even though a new window for dialogue seems to have opened, the option of a military strike still hangs over the Islamic Republic. Iran is a country facing a systemic crisis, and that would require deep reforms, yet its leaders do not appear fully ready to acknowledge that reality. We will continue to monitor developments on the ground and progress at the negotiating table, and what the future may hold for this complex and crucial country. Editorial support and production by Luigi Toninelli, Luca Puzzanghera, and Eleonora Marciani. If you enjoyed this episode, follow the Med Insight podcast on all major platforms, and for more analysis and updates, visit our website at med.ispionline.it. Thank you for listening.